All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for this pasture and hayland management presentation. Today we'll be talking about how to reduce weeds and grow more feed. And my name is Meghan Adamire. I'm with the Clallam Conservation District. I've been a planner at the district for about 16 years now. And I help folks with pasture management, manure management, mud management, all types of different things. So if you do need assistance, feel free to call. My coworker, Jen Bond, also does the same thing. She's not going to be on the presentation today, though, as she is on vacation. Lucky her. But I will be going through it today. So one of the things is, as we go through, if you have any questions, if you could please put them in the chat box and try to remain muted during the presentation, that would be great. At the very end, if anyone wants to unmute and ask questions, we should have a little bit of time to do so. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. First off, let's just talk a little bit about what conservation districts are. I know some of you on the presentation probably have worked with us before in the past, but just in case you haven't, conservation districts are nationwide grassroots organizations, and we're dedicated to protecting and improving natural resources. We also provide assistance to land users to help protect and conserve the natural resources of the entire Clallam County. So if you reside within Clallam County, we're happy to help you. And if you're in a different county, most counties do have conservation districts, especially within Washington. So many of them do the same types of things that we do. So for sure, check with your local conservation district. And all of our services are non-regulatory and they're free of charge. So we don't do anything with permits or fines or anything like that. We just come out and help you with meeting your resource goals. You can view quite a bit more about us on our website at www.clallamcd.org. And I just want to let everyone know we are recording this presentation today. Most folks signed up to receive the recorded version of this. So feel free to not take notes. And if you decide to go out and get some sunshine midway through, this recording will be available on our website. And we'll most likely email it out to you as well, just so you have it on hand. All right, so we are going to cover the benefits of proper pasture management, the fundamentals of grass growth, developing grazing management systems, monitoring forage production, just some pasture maintenance tips. We're going to talk about fertilization and irrigation. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about pasture innovation and forage species. So all of these things are very important in keeping weeds out of our pastures, which helps produce more forage. And I also am going to note here that I will be talking about pastures for the most part and won't actually be specifically saying hayland, but most of these management things that we're going to be talking about apply directly to hay systems as well. So keeping weeds out of hay fields can use most of these same types of techniques in order to do so. Okay, so healthy pastures, they reduce the potential for ingestion of poisonous plants by different animal species, also reduce the ingestion of worms as well if they're higher and the animals aren't eating as close to the ground. It also can help decrease the chances of colic in horses since they won't uptake as much sand or dirt and whatnot. It can decrease the development of respiratory problems for the similar reason that it can help with colic and that they won't be breathing quite as much dirt and dust. And healthy pastures also provide quite a bit of the feed needs that your animals require. So a 1,000-pound animal consumes about 3 to 4 tons of forage in a 6 to 7 month grazing period. And so a lot of this can be provided by the forage in your pastures if you have healthy pastures. Generally, with most animals, you're going to want to get them about 2.5% to 3% of their body weight. And so the soils in our area typically produce about 1.5 to 3 tons of forage per acre. And so a good rule of thumb for most animals of about 1,000-pound weight is that you want to have about 2 acres of pasture per animal. There's definitely different soil types throughout our area that you don't have to have as many acres as that to be able to provide that forage for some of the better producing soil types. But for the most part, around our county, if you stick with that 2 acres, you should have enough forage during the growing season to meet your animal needs if you have healthy pastures. Healthy pastures are also important in protecting water quality, as they help the grass utilize the nutrients that the manure provides from the animals. And they also help keep from having the streams have erosion and runoff problems as well, since grass can help filter out nutrients before it gets into waterways. So some of the signs of unhealthy pastures are overgrazed pastures. And when we refer to overgrazed, we are talking about a stubble height of less than 3 inches, which we'll talk about in just a moment a little bit more. Signs of unhealthy pastures are also that they are typically infested with weeds and often filled with large deposits of manure and a lot of bare spots as well. Okay, so overgrazing, as I mentioned, we consider overgrazing being leaving less than 3 inches of leaf material on a grass plant. And the reason that it is so important not to overgraze is that it can slow the regrowth and also damage the root system of plants, which can lead to the eventual death of the plants. So in these diagrams, we can see here that when we have a healthy grass plant over here on the left, healthy meaning about a 6 to 8 inch height, that root system below it is also going to be deeper and be able to get down into the soil to get moisture and nutrients from the soil. As we continue down to smaller stubble heights, shorter stubble heights, you can see that the plant there on the right-hand side has very shallow roots that mirror what's above ground for that grass plant. And so with that, that means that this plant over here that has been overgrazed is going to have a much tougher time grabbing moisture and nutrients. And over time, the root system is going to be damaged, the regrowth is going to be slowed, and eventually it's probably going to lead to the death of that plant. So just over here on the right-hand side, this photo shows exactly what the diagram shows just in real life for a grass plant. Okay, so overgrazing can occur in 2 main ways. One, leaving stock in a pasture for too long, or the second way is bringing them back into a pasture before it's ready to be grazed. So you can see here in this photo that these animals have most likely just been left on this pasture and not moved off very frequently. There's a lot of weeds out here, such as curly dock, which is the reddish colored one we see around our area quite frequently. And it also appears that there is tansy in there, which is a poisonous plant, and every bite that an animal takes of the tansy plant can count against them, against their livers. So it's just very important to not have a system like this. As you can see, there's not much grass out there for them to eat. So chances are at some point they may go and nibble on those weeds, which often leads to poisonings. Let's see, so Lisa, I cannot see the diagram. Let me go back one slide. Is anyone having trouble seeing the stubble and pasture health diagram there that shows the 3 grass plants? That was the one that I was referring to. Okay, well, hopefully everyone, oh no, can everyone see my presentation even? Okay, I wonder why that is not showing up. Okay. So I have mixed results on whether people, it sounds like the stubble and pasture health photo did not show up. Okay, well, I'm going to keep moving along, and I can always send that out if people aren't seeing that. Okay, yes, please let me know if you aren't seeing something I'm talking about. I appreciate that. I'm not sure why that wouldn't have popped up. I apologize for that. Okay, well, hopefully there's two photos showing up on the slide now. That's what I'm going for at this point. Okay, so year-round grazing. This is a strategy that is best not to adopt. You can see both of these situations. The animals have eaten these pastures. Oh, shoot. So, Lisa, it sounds like you're just seeing me. Is anyone else just seeing me and not the presentation? Okay, so somebody said that when they haven't been able to see the slides in Zoom, it helped if they signed out and back in. Um, Lisa, can you maybe sign out and then sign back in and see if that might work for you? Okay, and is Lisa the only one that's having that trouble? Has everyone else been able to see the year-round grazing slide that I have up right now? Okay, and then someone, Lisa, suggested that if you try to change your view, that may help with being able to see it. So fingers crossed that works. And if not, we will have the recording that hopefully would work for you. So sorry about that, Lisa. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving along. So year-round grazing, as we can see, it's just not a good strategy. This is what's going to lead to a lot of weeds in your pasture because of all the bare ground that is available for weed seeds to blow into and then take hold and grow. And it's also a situation in which we see animals get poisoned by poisonous weeds quite a bit more as well. And Lisa, it says that someone said that you can choose view options up the top and then choose side by side. I don't know if that might help you out. Thanks everybody for the suggestions. This is great. I miss being out in the field so much with you all. This is so tough to have to do these webinars. We love getting out and seeing everybody and doing these out on farms. So I really look forward to being able to do that in the future, I hope. Okay, so golden rule of grazing. Don't graze lower than 3 inches. I can't hammer that home hard enough. The lower you graze, the worse your root systems are going to get, the more damaged your grass plants are going to be, and then you're just going to invite weeds into your pastures. So what you want to do is you want to wait to regraze your grass until it's about 6 to 8 inches tall. So ideally, you graze down to about a 3 to 4 inch stubble height, and then you wait to regraze until your grass is 6 to 8 inches. And this can take a while during the growing season, potentially up to 4 to 5 weeks. So this is where having multiple pastures, which we'll talk about, and using a rotational grazing system is very valuable. Or having a heavy use area or a paddock where you can put them in while you're waiting for your grass to regrow is really crucial as well. Okay, so ideally you want to take half, leave half, just kind of hammering this home again. And this is just a great graphic to show what happens with the amount of leaf volume that you remove. So if you remove up to about 10 to 40% of the leaf material, you're not going to stop the root growth. It's just going to grow right back and it won't hurt the root growth at all. When you get into 50%, you're only going to stop the root growth by about 2 to 4%. However, when you start to take about 60 or more of the leaf volume away, that's when your root growth really stops. So at 60% of the leaf volume removed, you're going to have your root growth stopped by about 50%. And when you get up into these higher numbers, 80, 90%, 100% of your root growth is going to stop. So that's why it's really important to grow it up to about 6 to 8 inches, have them graze it down to 3 to 4 inches, and then pull them off so that you're not dipping down into this 60, 70, 80% of the leaf volume removed. You're kind of staying up there where it's at that 50% level where it's not really going to stop your root growth. So in our area, the growing season is typically going to be April to around October. For the most part, our grass plants around here go dormant during our cooler, wetter months, which are generally November to March. Here and there, if we do have some little warm up periods, there might be a little bit of green up, but for the most part, the plants are going to be dormant and it's best not to have animals on them through those cooler, wetter months of November to March. So under here, this shows how we have the dormant period here, and then the growth starts to pick up. It really ramps up in April, May, then it starts to taper down in June and July and throughout the other months. The reason being is that we don't get the moisture after about mid-May to June. You know, it kind of slows down. I mean, yes, we might still get some rain, but it's not going to be quite the amounts we are getting earlier in the spring. So the grass just starts to taper off and kind of start to go dormant during the summertime until we get a little more green up and some rain in September. So to keep grasses growing and encourage growth, you really need to try to keep grasses in what's called a vegetative state, because once they get a seed head, they typically go dormant. So if we can use grazing to keep our grasses from getting that seed head on it and keep them in what's called a vegetative state, it tricks them into needing to keep growing in order to reproduce. So that way we're going to be able to keep our grasses trying to grow more and more and more, rather than once they put a seed head on, they go dormant and they kind of said, you know, okay, I'm done. I reproduced for the year. I'm just going to slow down and hang out and wait. And so that's why even with something like a hay field, if we can get in there earlier, which is pretty hard in a lot of our different soils to do, just because they're so wet, and just with our climate, it's oftentimes going to be too wet to be able to produce hay until June, July. But if we can get our hay cuttings earlier before our grass plants get a seed head, then oftentimes we can keep them growing and keep them in that vegetative state and potentially get a second or third cutting off of those hay fields as well. So if you're not producing hay and you're just sticking with pastures, that's where you can use mowing as a tool to be able to keep your grasses at a vegetative state. Often we don't have enough livestock or horses to be able to keep our pastures in this state during the springtime. They just can't keep up. So going ahead and mowing the grass in order to keep them growing and keep that seed head from appearing can really help to actually increase the productivity of the pasture. Okay, and in the fall and the winter, what we want to do then is we want to make sure we remove animals from wet pastures, because the grass really can't handle this continuous trampling and grazing when they're dormant. They also, horses, especially with their hooves, kind of act as plungers, and they can compact wet soil, make a lot of ruts in the ground. So it's really just best to take your animals off pastures during the wintertime in order to keep from having a pretty big weed infestation the next year. Okay, so now we're just going to talk a little bit about the different animals and how they graze, kind of as a reasoning behind which ones are going to be the hardest on pastures. Okay, so horses graze fairly continuously, and they're not very efficient at converting grass to energy. So that's why they need to just kind of keep grazing, and they're not going to be like some of the other animals where, you know, they lie down and they chew their cud and they regurgitate that grass and keep utilizing it more and more. Horses are just going to keep grazing a lot. And that's why a lot of horse pastures look severely overgrazed. They also, they have top and bottom teeth, so they're going to grab the grass plants and they're just oftentimes going to pull them out, like right by the roots, even if it's too wet. And they can also graze down very low because of how their teeth are. You know, they can get down there and nip those grass plants very closely to the ground. And many of us that have horses, we probably have also noticed that they're very what we call patchy grazers, and they're kind of picky. So they like to go and graze one spot over and over and over, whereas another area they might completely miss and not graze at all, and it gets tall and stemmy, and then they're never going to go back and graze that. So a lot of times the horse pasture, even if there's no horses out there, we can tell just based on the overgrazed areas and the really tall areas that they didn't graze at all. So with horses, we do have to be a lot more concerned about some of the health problems that can be associated with them grazing on pastures. Founder is the main one that we see around here. And this is the time of year where you're often going to see horses that have founder from grass, and they're getting out there, they're grazing that lush grass and getting a lot of high concentration of sugar, and it can lead to laminitis. So right now we really want to be careful with how we turn our horses out onto grass, and if we haven't had them on pastures at all this year, to do it very slowly. And there is a good website for horse owners that are worried about grass-induced founder. It's safergrass.org. And we do have some resources at the Conservation District we can help you with as well if you want more information on that. But one of the things, just to tie this back into management of pastures, is that a lot of times I'll go out to farms and people will have very, very overgrazed pastures because they are worried about their horses foundering on a really nice, lush, well-managed pasture. And what they have found in many situations is that actually these overgrazed grasses, they're much more stressed, and they can produce a higher concentration of sugars that can potentially cause more problems than lush, well-managed pastures. So it's just something to be aware of, is that even these overgrazed pastures can definitely cause founder. And it is something to think about this time of year is, taking your animals and gradually increasing the duration of them grazing in a confinement area or a mud-free paddock, as we often term it as well, is a great way to do that. And then grazing muzzles are another thing that I actually use on my own horses pretty frequently, just to try to limit their intake and build them up to being able to graze longer and longer periods of time. So again, if you need more information on that, I'm not going to touch on that anymore, but we do have some more resources at the Conservation District we can help you with on that. All right, so switching over to cattle, they are much less likely to severely overgraze a pasture than horses because they don't have top teeth. So they actually have to wrap their tongue around the grass, which means that they're not going to be able to get down and nip that grass as closely as a horse. And they also are much more able to convert grass into energy better than horses as well. So typically cattle aren't going to be able to severely overgraze a pasture like a horse can. But that's something else that should be taken into consideration. If you have weeds out there and the grass, they just can't graze it down anymore, then they may really hit up those poisonous weeds to graze because they literally can't get anything more to eat out of what the grass plants are that are out there. Okay, let's see. So sheep, goats, llamas, and alpacas, oftentimes some of these animals tend to browse on things other than grass. They can eat a lot of the weeds and the shrubs and the trees. So they're not necessarily, going to be as affected by some of the poisonous plants that there are as cattle and horses can be. And again, some of these, I'm just kind of lumping them all together. So some are more affected than others. So it certainly isn't good to have any poisonous plants out in your pasture with any of these animals. But just know that these guys will tend to graze on other things as well. And so you should protect your trees if you have any out in the pastures. And these guys can also severely overgraze pastures as well. They have a split lip, so they can get down very close to the ground, and it makes it easy for them to nip the grass fairly low. So basically, just what all these animals really do have in common is that without actively managing them, they will overgraze pastures and then possibly undergraze others. And in a pasture setting, most of the time we're going to have about 25% wasted available forage that they just, they're going to go to the bathroom in, or they're just going to overgraze or undergraze, and it's going to lead to this forage being wasted. So that's where rotational grazing comes into play as a tool that can help create more even grazing and just more efficient grazers basically out of our animals. So rotational grazing can be as simple as having two pastures to rotate back and forth, or it can be a much more elaborate system. It can be 16 fields that you rotate through once a day, like one of the farms that we have in Agnew does. And I will tell you, they have excellent grass pastures and they do a great job of it, but it's very time intensive. So we'll look at that a little bit more here. With rotational grazing, I want to hit back on that rest. You want to rest your pastures during the winter. And then with these systems, you want to rotate to the new pasture when your grass is grazed down to about 3 inches. And you want to wait to regraze the new pasture until it reaches a height of about 6 to 8 inches. And they found with studies that the more paddocks you have, the more grass you can grow, because you can just have more efficiency with how you graze these pastures. So when you're planning a rotational grazing system, there's some things you want to consider. One of the first things is just to look at the number of animals you have and the number of pastures. Trying to figure out if you only have 5 sheep and you have 20 pastures, well, rotational grazing, might not be that necessary. Maybe just having 2 or 3 small little pastures that you kind of move them through to try to get them to graze more. But you're probably going to want to mow something like that, or you're going to have way too much pasture, versus if you have 10 horses and you only have 5 acres. Well, then, in something like that, you're going to want to try to have more paddocks to rotate through, because you have more animals than what your pastures are going to be able to be capable of producing forage. And then you'd want to entertain doing a confinement area as having it part of your grazing system, so that you could let your pastures rest until they were at that 6 to 8 inch mark before you move them back out into them. One of the other things that you need to consider with rotational grazing system is just the cost. It can be very simple to create these, just some electric fences, or they can be very elaborate with more permanent fences in between. And then also the time it takes to move your animals through. The more paddocks you have, most likely the more time intensive it will be. But there are ways, which we'll look at some pictures, to set up systems that animals can move through fairly easily. So some of the other things that you need to think about when you're planning a rotational grazing system is where your existing water facilities are, where your barn is, where your confinement area is, where you have mineral blocks set out at. And you might want to base your system based on something like this. So for instance, in this one photo, they decided to base their fence system around their round stock tank. So they basically used it to take their fence posts and radiate out from there, so that they just have one stock tank that the animals will drink from all these different pastures that they have created. And a lot of times people will use a barn as their source of where they're going to start their rotational grazing system at as well. Okay, so fencing is another consideration. What's best to do, in my opinion, what seems to kind of work the best for people, is to maintain a permanent perimeter fence, which you always want to have no matter what anyway. I believe in Washington State, it's equivalent to like a 4-strand barbed wire fence that is required in order to keep your animals in, so that if they got out, it's less of a chance of a lawsuit, since you had kind of what's equivalent to the Washington State law of a fence. And of course, for horse owners, we don't necessarily want barbed wire, so a really stout wood fence or a barbless wire fence would also be something like that as well. And then in the perimeter, that's where you can use electric wire or electric tape to create more of these pastures or paddocks that you can move animals through. And a lot of people find that the gate handles, they just, they'll have a couple of gate handles and they'll kind of move down through and move 20, 30 feet over through a lane as they go. And it works really well for them, as long as their perimeter fence has an electric fence that it's offset by. So then they can always just use their gate handles and hook onto that electric fence that is on their perimeter fence. I hope that makes sense. I wish we were able to be out in the field so I could show everyone these techniques. It's hard to do it on pictures, that's for sure. So when you're planning a rotational grazing system, another thing in addition to water systems and barns and things is to subdivide your land based on the differences it has. So in this particular field, you can see that it's much more green over here on this far right side. So it's probably a lot wetter in that area where it looks to be a little bit more dry in the area closest to us on the photo. And so if you can plan a rotational grazing system where it has the wetter area being grazed later on in the springtime and the drier area earlier in the spring, that way you can take advantage of the differences in your land to have this pasture that's going to be too wet to graze earlier in the season, wait to be grazed a little bit later on, and then this drier area, you can get them in and start grazing them a little bit earlier in the year when it dries out. So this is just an example of a rotational grazing system. Right here, you can see that this particular one on the left doesn't have the rotational grazing system. So this is just kind of a year-round grazing system, probably infested with weeds and doesn't have a very good stubble height in this situation here. Whereas on the right-hand side, they took what they had, they took their barn and their little watering trough here. They created a confinement area around their barn that they can put their animals in during the winter time, and also when their pastures are too low to put their animals back out in during the grazing season. And then off of there, they radiated out from the barn to create 4 different pasture areas that they can rotate through. So in this setting, they have 5 different units, paddocks essentially, that they can rotate their animals through. 4 pastures, one being the confinement area when the other pastures are just too low to be able to be grazed on. So this is an excellent example of how you can create a fairly low cost and low, time intensive management system as well, and that they can just close those gates and keep the animals out of the pastures that they don't want them to be in and not have to do a whole lot of active management. This is just another example where they have kind of this confinement area as well, the dirt area, and then some pastures they can move through into. So 6 in this case, some different gates that they have going around here. And in this one, they have their water in this one that they're calling a holding pasture. So that's kind of why it's important to have each of these be able to have a lane to get back to the water there. And just one more, this is an example of how you can make a rotational grazing system even more intense and really just get the maximum amount of forage possible. This is going to take a little bit more time. It's going to be more time intensive because, as you can see, they're actually taking each of these strips of pastures and breaking them down into smaller pastures. So they have just an electric fence that they would move back, keep moving it down this lane, this pasture lane every day. And so each day they just have a small area that these cows are going to graze in, then they'll move them to the next one and so on. And they'll do this throughout this whole area. The great part about this is, in essence, it's going to give them 24 days of grazing. So hopefully, depending if they have irrigation and how healthy these pastures are, when they come back to this system on day 25, hopefully this is going to be ready to be grazed again. So then they can just go through and do this whole system again. And that said, if you look at your land and you see that there's a pasture that's ready to go, just because it's not in the, rotation that it might look to be. So for instance, if they graze all of pasture 1, but pasture 2 isn't ready and pasture 3 is, then there's no reason they can't hop over to pasture 3. So it's just, a lot of this is going to be kind of seeing how it works as you go and modifying a grazing system based on sort of weather and soil types and how your forage is looking at the time. So as I mentioned, monitoring is very important. And so in this is a pasture grazing stick, but you can very easily just take a ruler out there. If your grass is up to about 6 to 8 inches, that's your key to start grazing. So this right in here would be a 6 to 8 inch mark where it says start grazing. And if it's down here, you can kind of see where there's some little red hash marks. That would be more of your 3 to 4 inch stubble height that says, no, it's not going to be ready to graze yet. That's when you want to hold off and wait until your grass is ready to be grazed. So 3 important questions to ask yourself as you're grazing is to look behind you. So what rest period do your pastures actually need to have? And then look ahead as well. Has that paddock that you're going to be turning them into had enough rest that it's 6 to 8 inches and ready for your animals to graze? Or do you need to wait before you do that? And then you also want to look at where your animals currently are in your rotational grazing system to make sure that your stocking rate is correct in that pasture that they're in. So as I mentioned, it really varies, based on weather patterns and so many different things. But it's one of the keys to be able to grow healthy pastures that are going to keep weeds out of those pastures in the long run is using this rotational grazing system and just constantly changing with what you need to do based on all these different factors in play. Okay, so I kind of already covered these actually. I forgot I had these slides, but look behind means making decisions about the grazing periods and how much rest is needed. So really walk out there in those pastures that your animals have grazed to figure out how much regrowth has happened. And so if your grass has only grown a couple inches in 1 to 2 weeks, then you can plan shorter rest periods, something more like 30 days, a month and a half. And if you haven't had a whole lot of regrowth in 1 to 2 weeks, then you're probably going to need to plan for longer rest periods, a couple months or more even potentially. And really the amount of damage that your pastures already had and what forage species you have out there, they can all kind of play a part in how long this rest period is going to take as well. Okay, so now we're going to jump into pasture maintenance and some of the things that you can do with your pastures, right now. You can start this right now without doing any input of new fencing or anything like that. So we're going to look at monitoring, mowing, dragging, testing your soils, fertilizing, seed and renovation, and weed control as well. But we're just very briefly going to touch on the weed control, as next Monday we have a presentation that is designed to talk specifically about our top 12 weeds that we see in Clallam County over and over and how to control those weeds. Okay, so when you mow a pasture, generally it's best to set your mowing deck on your tractor to about 4 to 5 inches. If you go lower than that, what oftentimes seems like it can happen is areas can get scalped by accident and get cut a lot shorter. So you might have to play around with that a little bit more, but try not to ever mow lower than 4 inches because you want to basically use mowing to mimic what you would be doing with grazing. And so a couple times to mow is one, after a pasture's been grazed, to try to get all the grass at kind of this uniform height and also clip off weed seeds. Or another time to mow is, as I mentioned earlier, if your animals can't keep up with grass growth, with that rapid growth that we are getting like right now and starting to get in the spring. So mowing actually helps encourage new grass growth, the same as proper grazing does. It really encourages grass plants to keep putting out more leaf material and more tillers. And mowing can help make grass more palatable as well. And it also helps keep grass from developing seed heads, which keeps it from going dormant so that it will keep on producing more and more forage. And most of our weed seeds, a lot of times the growing points on weed seeds are higher than what the growing points are on grass plants. So that's why we can get by with mowing grass and grazing it down to about 3 to 4 inches. It doesn't damage the growing points because they're below that. Whereas a lot of the weeds, if you mow them, it actually kind of damages them because their growing points are a little higher than some of the grass plants. And it also is going to help keep them from going to seed if you mow them as well. So long-term mowing can really be beneficial to helping get weeds out of pastures. Okay, dragging is another important piece for healthy pastures. It helps break up clumps of manure, which is especially important in like horse pastures, where a lot of times they're gonna end up going to the bathroom a lot in the same area. Dragging can really help spread the nutrients out that are in the manure so that you have much more even regrowth of pastures as well. So the folks that I've seen that have mower deck, and then they have something like a pasture drag. It can even be as simple as a chain link fence or something like that, that they could attach behind their mower and just do it all in one shot. Those are the systems that seem to, continue to keep up on this kind of maintenance. And so if you can rig up something like that, that's really ideal. Okay, so now we're going to jump into fertilization. Fertilization is really important because it can lead to obviously more forage production because we're meeting the nutrient needs of pastures. So long term, you're going to have healthier pastures, fewer weeds, less moss, and it can also help raise protein in feed as well. So what we see in a low fertility pasture, which I will say most of our pastures in Clallam County will have some deficiencies in fertility. With the high rainfall that we get, the nutrient leaches out during the winter, the fall, winter, and early spring months when we get a lot of rain and the grass isn't growing. So they're almost always going to be deficient in nitrogen. And we also see deficiencies in phosphorus and potassium very regularly as well. So when we look out and we see a lot of bright green grass around manure piles in a pasture, we see a lot of short, wispy, unproductive species of grass and high amounts of moss and weeds, then oftentimes those are signs of a low fertility pasture. And these are just a couple of pictures of that. You can see if this pasture had the fertility amended. It's a fairly healthy pasture in that it's not too overgrazed, but you can see these manure spots, these big green patches out here. If the whole field had the amount of nutrients that some of these big green patches had, it would be producing a lot more forage than it currently is. And then we have pastures like this that one, this has probably been way too overgrazed, but two, it probably is very unproductive as well. When we see a lot of buttercup like this, oftentimes the soil tests that come back from them show that they're low in nutrients. And then oftentimes they also have a pH that is too low as well. So too acidic for grass plants to really grow well in those. And we did a recording back in February talking about nutrients and soil testing and things like that. So if you do have more questions about this, I'd suggest going back and viewing that recording to learn just a little bit more about fertility of grass plants and how to amend your fertility. So it is important to test your soil if you can before putting nutrients out there. We have had quite a few people get back soil tests and, they would have just gotten a plain old, fertilizer from the store or whatever was recommended to them and put it down. And then they found out that, maybe they didn't need that much phosphorus out there, that much potassium, and they would have been wasting their money. And then also just putting nutrients in their soil that they didn't need if they hadn't got a soil test. So I would suggest getting a soil test. And we hopefully will be starting our soil testing service back up again, probably not until next fall or maybe next spring. But we have in the past actually taken soil tests in our office and then sent them off to a lab and helped people interpret the results. But with COVID, our staff is primarily working from home. So we're not taking the samples at our office, but we do have detailed instructions on our website of how to submit a test directly to the lab that we do. And then once you get your results back, we can help you with interpreting that soil test and figuring out what you actually need to apply for fertilizer. So on our website, we have this guide here. I just pulled a snapshot from the guide to kind of show how to take a soil sample. And so we have that on our website. I'm not going to dwell on this now, but you can look on there for information on how to collect your soil test or watch that recording as well, which is available on our website under past workshops for more information on soil testing. So by fertilizing according to a soil test, you can definitely help lower the amount of weeds, moss, and have healthier grass, as I mentioned before. And I like to show this photo. On the right-hand side here, this pasture, actually, I think it's a hayfield. I'm sorry. This hayfield looked the same as this one on the left in that it had a ton of daisies. It was covered in daisies. It was driving the lady crazy. So she got a soil test and she started to put down fertilizer and, mow at the right times. And she did some pulling as well of the daisies. But eventually she has pretty much been able to get those daisies completely out of her hayfield. And by increasing her fertility, that helped a lot with being able to do that. So it is amazing just what having some more nutrients can do for your fields, because they really are going to feed those grass plants and help those grass plants become much more healthy to keep the weeds out of the system, and then also limit the growth of the ones that are already there so they can't continue to spread more and more and more. So the nutrients for pastures that are most important are nitrogen, which is key for grass leaf growth, phosphorus, which is very important for root systems, and then potassium, which is important for disease resistance. So as I mentioned, almost all of these are going to be ones that people may be low in pastures. And these are all things that a soil test will help you determine if your pastures are low in. So when applying fertilizers, and this is talking specifically about commercial fertilizers, not necessarily organic, which there's kind of some different parameters with them. But with the commercial fertilizers, you want to make sure you apply only during the growing season so that grass plants are actively growing and can actually take up the nutrients that are being put down. If you put them on when the grass is still dormant or when there's a very heavy rainstorm, you can oftentimes risk having that fertilizer, those nutrients run off or just leach out of your soil. So be very careful with that. And when you apply fertilizer, if you have overgrazed pastures, you don't want to apply fertilizer. This isn't going to be a fix for pastures that are lower than 3 inches in stubble height. It pretty much would just be dumping money down the toilet. As we saw with our photos earlier of what grass plants that are overgrazed, what their root systems look like. If you only have, less than 3 inches of stubble height on your pastures, then that means that your root system below is also going to be very, very short, mirroring that roughly about 3 inches as well. So if you put down fertilizer and then you get some rainfall, all the nutrients for the most part will just leach out and not be available to those plants. The phosphorus and potassium, they do move slower through the root or through the soil. So they might not leach out as much, but it's still just kind of a waste of money to put down fertilizer when your grass has such a short stubble height. Okay, so if you can't take a soil test, a rule of thumb that we have gotten from Washington State University Extension is to apply 80 pounds of phosphorus and potassium and 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year, and then split those into 2 applications, one in the early spring and then one in the early fall before heavy rains. I will just say though, with this kind of rule of thumb that I'm giving you, I have definitely seen quite a few pastures that still have sufficient phosphorus, especially that were old dairies back in the day. So even if they were a dairy 50 years ago, oftentimes the amount of phosphorus they applied in the manure will build up the phosphorus in the soil to the point where there's still plenty of phosphorus left out there now. So ideally, a $20, $25 soil test, it can tell you what you actually need, and it's most likely money well spent. So you have, kind of a goal that you can meet for getting that fertilizer out there and not exceeding what you actually need. And then this photo here, it just shows how to read a fertilizer label. Typically, there's just going to be a ratio with 5 numbers. The first number is going to be nitrogen. The second would be the phosphorus available. And the third number, the 15 here, is the amount of potash or potassium that would be available for your plants when you put that on. And so in this case, the 5, 10, 15, that's going to be kind of the percentage that's in that bag. The rest of the amount would be filler. So in this case, there's 5% nitrogen, 10% of the phosphate, phosphorus needs, and then 15% of the potash. Okay, so another important piece that a soil test will tell you, and that are very important for growing healthy pastures, is how much lime that you might need. And so lime helps raise the pH of the soils to make them less acidic. Grass plants tend to like a pH of about 6, even up to 6.5, whereas a lot of times weeds like a pH that's lower. So if we can raise the pH up of our soils, we can oftentimes just help our grass plants get healthier and our weeds get unhealthier just by a simple switch like that. If you have no soil tests, applying at a rate of about 1 to 2 tons per acre per year is good to put down. That said, though, lime sticks with your soil for a very long time, and it moves very slowly, about a ½ inch per year through the soil. So a lot of times you can put lime down and then be done and not need to put lime down for many years, maybe even a decade or more. And so that's where that soil test comes in really handy. So you're not just continuing to put more and more lime down that you might need. And fall is a great time of year to apply lime so that it can be incorporated in during the winter rains and move down through the soil. If you have irrigation, then it's fine to put it on this time of year as well. Just know that it does move slowly down through. And I had a question come in, someone fertilized and they could only find 1616. That should be just fine to use. I would just maybe wait until the fall and take a soil test to see, where that put you, if that puts your soil in a good spot, or if you need to put down more. I'm not familiar with your farm. Jennifer might have worked with you, so she might actually be able to tell you if that was a good one to put down or not. But generally something like that, it's not going to be, exceeding what you needed to have. So that little bit you put out there is probably just fine to use. With the soil test, though, that's where you can really make that decision of whether or not you want to find a fertilizer that maybe is higher in nitrogen and lower in phosphorus and potassium, or maybe the reverse. So that's where trying to match them up. And it can be hard to find fertilizer around here. I do have a list of different places that we check with. And so at the end, you might be able to find another one, next year, if you don't want to do a 1616, that would have something a little bit different than that, and maybe more closer to what that rule of thumb that we mentioned earlier would do. Or if you have a soil test by then you can really tailor what you're applying based on that soil test. Okay, so I'm not going to get into pasture irrigation much, but I always like to throw it out there just so folks who do have irrigation water kind of have a rule of thumb. Typically about 1 inch of water per week during the growing season it works very well for pastures. You want to irrigate deep, but not too often, to encourage a deeper root growth. But you don't want to over irrigate. Over irrigate will end up pushing your nutrients out of the root zone. So something that's good to do after you irrigate is to just dig a hole and see how deep that water went down. If it went down really, really deep and out of your root zone, then you probably want to back it off next time and not put as many inches down. And different soil types are going to be so different in how much irrigation water they need. And we can help with that. We have irrigation water management system, like a little plan type of thing that we can help you with, that incorporates in where you're at in the county and how much or what soil type that you have, and then what every month kind of what our typical climate is and how much rainfall we get to try to help you keep from over irrigating. So feel free to contact us if you would like help with that. And just one last thing with the irrigation is try not to turn your animals out immediately after you irrigate. It'll be kind of the same thing as when you turn animals out on pastures during the wet months. They can really compact the soil. They can pull the plants out by the roots a lot easier. So it's just better to let the plants kind of dry out, the soil dry out a little bit before you put them back in there. Okay, so now we're going to move on to when to renovate or replant a pasture. So generally, when I go out to a farm and someone's talking about replanting a pasture, I usually try to have them go through a lot of the other steps first before they do it. It can be very time intensive and costly to replant a pasture, and oftentimes it can fail. So it's much better to make sure that you have your soil fertility spot on, you have your grazing management system, your rotational grazing systems in place so that you're never going to overgraze, and things like that before you consider that. But if you have decided that you want to go ahead and do some renovation or some replanting, first kind of look at the different scenarios where you might be doing that. So one might be a conversion where you've maybe taken out some trees or brush and you're going to create a new pasture. Another might be an older pasture that's been poorly managed and isn't yielding a whole lot of forage. So it's kind of like your last option, as I mentioned, is you want to try other means to improve that before you decide to do that. If you do have a significant weed infestation, that's another time where you might want to look at renovating or replanting. And then a sacrifice pasture, which oftentimes is an area used during the winter months to put your animals in so that they're not damaging all of your pastures. And a lot of times sacrifice pastures are going to have a lot of bare ground, so that's why it's good to reseed those. So now we're going to touch on kind of different ways to replant those areas. So first off, when you are renovating pastures, you don't want to do them all at once. If you do that, what can happen if they fail is you can end up with no forage at all. So ideally take just a small portion of your property and reseed that and just move through, every year, kind of do another section one at a time. Now, of course, if you're doing a conversion from something like forest land to pasture land, then in that situation, obviously you could do the whole thing at once. But if it's just a pasture that you're renovating, you might want to do this in smaller chunks. And before you seed, you really should test your soil and take potentially a couple years even to amend your soil before putting the seed down. If you are going to go ahead with a reseeding, you want to do it now. If you wait any later in the year, it's probably going to be too late, as to germinate, these plants really need to have either rain or irrigation. So if you have irrigation, you're going to definitely buy yourself more time. You can do it later on in the year. But if you are just looking at rainfall to be able to water your seeding, you really need to get out there now and replant. Okay, so some of the steps to a renovating pasture, and we're going to go through all these in more detail. You want to select your grass species based on your site, and make sure you kill any existing vegetation, create a firm seed bed, seed to a depth of about 1/4 inch, harrow or drag the soil after you've seeded, and then make sure you continue to control weeds in that area, and use a pull test before grazing, which we'll talk more about. Okay, so when you're renovating your pastures and you're trying to choose which grass species you want to plant, there's several things to look at. The livestock type, your soil type, and then also how much management time you are willing to invest to make sure that that particular forage species stays healthy. There are seed mixes available at local feed and garden stores. And so be sure, you ask questions or you read the labels on some of those mixes that they have as well, pretty closely to determine if they fit your needs. So one of the first things you want to ask yourself is whether or not this is a temporary pasture or a permanent pasture. So if you're planting a sacrifice pasture just to cover the bare soil before winter rains, then a lot of times you can choose more of an annual species like an annual ryegrass that will germinate quickly. It's a much more affordable option, but it will typically only grow for about 1 season unless you let it go to seed, and then it'll continue to grow more and more. So coming out of winter now, if you have one of those sacrifice pastures and it is all bare, taking and putting one of these annual species in is a great thing to do right now to make sure that the weeds aren't going to take hold throughout the summer when there's a bunch of bare ground out there. So if you're planting a more permanent pasture, though, that you're going to actively manage for forage production, you'd want to choose a perennial pasture species, which are more expensive, and they also might take a little longer to germinate, but they're going to be much more productive, and they're going to be a much better long-term forage option for you. So we're going to look at the species. We're just going to cover these kind of quickly so you kind of know some of the ones that you would want to look for when you go to a store to purchase them. So orchard grass is one of the main forage species that is in our area, and it does very, very well. It's good quality, it has good regrowth, and it's shade tolerant. So it really fits the bill in a lot of our pastures around here. The disadvantages of it are it does suffer when it is grazed continually, and it does like fairly well-drained soil. So if you have a very, very wet pasture, orchard grass may not do that great over time. Perennial ryegrass is another one that we see in pastures commonly in Clallam County. It's very, very good quality grass. It's easy to establish, and it does have a good tolerance for closer grazing. However, it doesn't do well in shady situations, and again, it likes well-drained soils. So I'd say even more so than orchard grass. I don't see ryegrass terribly often west of Port Angeles. You know, it'll be there sometimes in some of the drier areas, but it just isn't one I see as commonly, whereas orchard grass is one that I see much more commonly west of Port Angeles in the wetter soils. So perennial ryegrass, it seems to do really well in swim. It can do well west of Port Angeles, but it likes those much more well-drained soils. So tall fescue, we see throughout our county. It's good quality. It does have a lot of tillering that is stimulated through frequent grazing. So it'll just kind of keep creating, you know, more and more grass from little tillers that stick out through frequent grazing. And it does have good fall growth, and it does grow well in both poorly and well-drained soils. So this is a great option if you do have some more poorly drained soils. One of the things to check on is that you get an endophyte-free version of tall fescue. Typically, most pasture species will be. The endophyte was something that was designed to kind of make a more hardy grass plant for lawns and things like that, but it can cause problems for health for horses and cattle, and actually probably sheep as well, I believe. And so you want to just make sure that it does say on the label that it's endophyte free, or if it's a pasture mix, then it most likely is going to be endophyte free. Okay, so Timothy, this is an excellent high quality grass. It's easy to establish, and it does do very well in poorly drained soils. However, it is not going to be one you want to use in pasture system, only in hay systems, because it does not do well with low grazing or frequent grazing. So it doesn't regrow very well. Its growing points are a little bit higher than some of the other grasses. So this is one that you wouldn't want to have in a pasture situation, or it's just going to get grazed out fairly quickly. Okay, so those were kind of our main four forage producing grasses that we would want to see planted in a field or a hay field in the case of Timothy. So now we're just going to touch quickly on legumes. They are plants that fix nitrogen from the air. So legumes are nice to have in a pasture system, as they can often reduce the need for nitrogen fertilizers, and they often are more productive in the summer than grasses. They seem to just kind of get their roots down in there and get more moisture out of the soil and keep producing, whereas the grass plants oftentimes go dormant. So bird's foot trefoil is one that was planted pretty commonly back maybe 20, 30 years ago, maybe even farther than that, especially west of Port Angeles. We still see that in some of the systems out there, and it's excellent quality. It does very well in a variety of different soils and conditions, including wet soils. It can be grazed frequently, but not too closely, and it can be slow to establish. So this is one that you could consider putting in a pasture system, especially if you had wetter soils. Red clover is another great legume. It's good quality. It establishes very easily. However, in some situations, it's not going to persist very long. So it may only do well for a couple growing seasons, and then it may start to kind of like fall out of the system. It does like well-drained soils as well. And one thing with legumes, if you are producing hay, they can tend to be a little bit harder to dry out in hay. So sometimes these will be the things that you'll kind of see mold and whatnot in hay. So it is kind of something to be aware of if you are producing hay, that you might not want to have a mix of legumes in there. This kind of more is for like west of Port Angeles, or even like East Port Angeles, places where we're producing hay, where we get more moisture and it's a lot harder to get our hay to dry out. So those are the areas where I've seen a lot of molds and stuff associated with clovers and hays out there. Okay, white clover is another option to put in pastures. It's excellent quality and it does tolerate close grazing very well and continuous grazing as well. And it does do good in a variety of soils and conditions. It is pretty low yielding depending on what type of white clover it is that you have in a pasture system. And it also may cause bloat in some animals. So it's one to kind of be a little bit careful of using, and making sure that you're not going to create problems with your animals if you have too much white clover in a system. Okay, so we didn't touch on alfalfa. Alfalfa is kind of mainly specific to squim. I haven't seen it do very well in other parts of our county, but that is another one that can be used in pasture systems as well, just to touch on that. Okay, so here is a little bit of information on some seed cost estimates. These were developed back in the fall, so I'm not sure if they've maybe gone up a little bit in prices now, but just to kind of give you an idea, a 50-pound bag of orchard grass is around $200, a 50-pound bag of tall fescue around $100, perennial ryegrass about $115, whereas a 50-pound bag of annual ryegrass, which as we talked about, would be best in something like a sacrifice pasture, not necessarily a permanent pasture, that's about $45. So if you have a bare area right now that you use as a sacrifice pasture, getting that annual ryegrass out there at that $45 a bag, that's going to be a good option just to get some good coverage to keep your weed species out. There's also a lot of pre-mixed pasture seed options that have a lot of different multi-grass species in them. They kind of range in prices, and watch the label on those, because oftentimes those can have a lot of white clover in them, which if you already have a lot of white clover out in your field and you're just trying to do a reseed, you don't necessarily want a bunch more clover. Or a lot of them put timothy as well. And if it's a high concentration of timothy, then that's going to end up probably getting overgrazed in your system and not lasting for a really long time. So kind of look at the label to make sure that pre-mixed pasture seed would be something you would want for your system, versus buying these separate bags and kind of mixing your own. Okay, so one of the things that you need to do is eradicate existing vegetation in order to be able to get your grass seed to take. So we'll talk a little bit about overseeding versus reseeding. And regardless of what you do, you need to have good soil to seed contact. So you need to have your soil exposed, and you can till, spray, or use a combination of both methods to kill existing vegetation, or you can overgraze very heavily with livestock. That's another option that often a lot of people go to that, since it doesn't require the machinery that you're going to need to be able to do the other one. So this is just a photo that shows some of the means that you can use to do that. You can see the pigs overgrazing this strip of pasture here so that it can be planted. This is just a drag that they're dragging around to, that you can use to expose more. You can plow it. Just kind of some different ways there that you can do that. And when you create a seed bed, you need to make sure it's somewhat firm. So when you walk across it, you want to leave footprints that are only about a 1/4 inch deep. Because what will happen is the seeds will dry out and they won't germinate if you have too fluffy of a seed bed or too compacted of a seed bed. And if you can get a roller to help pack that seed bed, that's really ideal to be able to get that properly firm seed bed. Okay, so the main time where you're going to want to make sure that you have the proper amount of seed is depending on if you're overseeding or reseeding. And so we have a really great guide. It's called the Pasture and Hayland Renovation Guide, and I'll email that to you all. And there's a table on page 1 and 2. There's a table 1 and 2 on page 4 and 5 of that guide that tells you how much you're going to need based on your soil type, the condition of your seed bed, and the type of seed, and your use that you're planning to do with that pasture. So this is just an example. I know you guys can't read this, but this will be in the emailed version that I send you. So up top on this, it asks you what your soil type is. Then it asks you if you're using it for grazing or hay, or exclusively hay, or exercise, or just temporary cover. And then it lists out all the different species that would be good to use based on these different soil types. And then on this right-hand side, this is a seeding rate calculator. So you can decide if you have a well-prepared tilled seed bed, or if you have a roughly prepared seed bed with hardly any tillage, and then choose which species you want and multiply it out to figure out the rate that you need to have of each of those species in order to get what you would like to have out in your pasture. So this is just an excellent way that you can figure out what is going to work best out in your pasture or hay land situation. So in general, when you're seeding a new pasture, it needs about 25 pounds of live seed per acre. Again, though, I would really use that seeding rate calculator because different types of species will be different amount of pounds of live seed that you need. When you're overgrazing and you have existing vegetation still out there, your seeding rate will really vary depending on your condition. But in general, you want to put at least 10 pounds of live seed per acre down. And that would just be broadcast over what you have already out there, and trying to get as much seed to soil contact as you can by dragging around a drag or something. But oftentimes overseeding just doesn't have that effective of germination rates. It's hard on an overseeding condition to get plants to germinate. Okay, so in your seeding pastures, again, make sure you seed to a depth of about 1/4 inch. It's better to go shallower rather than deep. And if you can use some type of a seeding equipment, that's best, but hand broadcasting also works as well. I don't know if we have any equipment available for rental or use around at any of our stores, but I'd still suggest checking with them to see if they did have something, if you didn't have any equipment of your own. And these are just some of the different types of equipment that you can use if you don't have a tractor. So you can just use a push spreader like you would with a lawn. And you can just use a pull behind a lawnmower, even, or riding lawnmower. These pull type spreaders, they're available at some of the farm stores that we have locally. And then you can go even as low tech as a hand broadcast a shoulder bag. If it's just a small area like a sacrifice pasture, this would work just fine. Then we have our larger equipment that would be more tractor driven, our seeders. We have a manure spreader as well, and then a cone spreader to be able to help spread fertilizer and things like that. So there's quite a few different equipment options out there, and checking with your local farm store is usually the best route to go for that. Okay, so when you're renovating your pastures, you want to make sure you cover the seed lightly with soil by dragging or harrowing it. And a lot of people have just used old bed springs, chain link fence weighted down, anything like that, just to get that seed to soil contact so that the birds aren't going to come in and grab all your seed and fly away with it. So when determining if pastures are ready or not after they've germinated to be able to be grazed, you want to go out and actually pull your grass to see if it comes up by the roots or not. If it does, they're not going to be ready to graze. And if it doesn't, then you can go ahead and put animals on them, but be very careful about grazing newly planted or renovated pastures. It can be really easy to have those plants damaged since they're new little baby plants. And so just lightly use it for about a year following planting to make sure that they're very well established before getting grazed heavily. Okay, so some of our local resources for fertilizer, lime, grass seed, and equipment as well on some of these are Coastal Farm and Ranch, Leets Farms, Clallam Co-op, and Airport Garden as well, which is in Port Angeles. The others are in the Sequim area. I don't know if Airport Garden has equipment. I don't believe so, but I believe they have fertilizer, lime, and grass seed out there. Okay, so to tie this back to weed control, I know I've mentioned this a few times before, but really your best control for weeds is trying to prevent them by having healthy pastures and no bare soil. You want to make sure your grass plants are going to stay healthy so that they can really outcompete the weeds and keep them from coming into your pasture systems and hay systems as well. If you do have weeds out there, you can look at mechanical control by hand pulling them or mowing before they flower or seed. And if you really have a bad infestation, that's where herbicide may end up being something that you have to look into. And Clallam County noxious weeds is where you would want to call to ask for specific herbicide recommendations. And so these 3 weeds that we have pictures of up here, we have nightshade at the top. In the lower right-hand corner, we have poison hemlock, and then the yellow plant there, we have tansy ragwort, all of which are very, very poisonous for animals. And I know of animals in Clallam County that have died from all 3 of these. So these are ones that we will talk about on Monday at our presentation, which is 3:30 next Monday, where Kathy Lucero with Clallam County Noxious Weeds will talk about control of these 3 as well as 9 other weeds that we find in pastures. So definitely tune into that for more information on weed control. And just to kind of wrap this up with our key points for healthy weed-free pastures, don't overgraze them. Try not to go below about 3 to 4 inches. Take a soil test to determine your fertilizer needs to help get your pasture fertility up to where it needs to be to keep your plants healthy. If you need to replant pastures, do it now or wait until the fall as well. But right now, if you can get out there and get some seed down to be able to keep the bare ground away, that's going to help a lot with keeping the weeds out of your pastures as they blow around this coming summertime. And then also create winter feeding and confinement areas to keep animals off wet pastures, which will help keep your pastures a lot healthier and just reduce the risk of weeds being out there as well. Okay, so everyone that registered, I will be sending them a link to these pasture management publications, Managing Healthy Pastures in Clallam County, and then also the Pasture and Hayland renovation guide that I mentioned earlier that has the seeding calculator in it. And now if anyone has any questions, we can turn off, you guys can turn off your mute buttons if you have questions or put them in the chat. Or if you don't have any questions right now, you can get onto our website. We have a conservation on the farm page where we do have a horse and livestock mailing list that we try to send out workshop announcements to. And then we also have a button on there. You can click to request site-specific assistance if you need somebody to come out and visit your farm and give you any specific help. So like I said earlier, my coworker Jen Bond and myself, Meghan Adamire, we're both happy to come out onto your farm. We're able to, we wear masks now with COVID procedures, but we can come on out and walk your property and help you out any way that you need help with. So thank you guys for joining. I hope you can go out and enjoy the sunshine. It's been peeking in here the window at me, and I've been ready to be done with this and go out and play. So I hope you all can get out there as well. All right, well, that's the end of our presentation. So I will, I'm gonna end this call now. I don't see any more questions. Thank you guys all for joining.